Baroness Northover, thank you so much for joining us today. The end of day one of Doha Forum 2022. I want to jump straight in with obviously a situation that's dominating headlines at the moment. That is the UK, the response to Russia and the invasion of Ukraine. What's your perspective on the UK's response to this conflict, this situation?
Well, I think that people were very shocked in the United Kingdom and within Europe and the West, I suppose. The feeling that we hadn't been in this kind of situation since the Second World War, though of course there was conflict in the Balkans and in Europe, but that an invasion of a European country wasn't something that people anticipated, and there really has been a lot of shock. It's very interesting coming here because you can hear from others pointing out that there hasn't necessarily been that kind of global reaction to other conflicts in other parts of the world, including in this region. And I think that's an understandable reaction. However, I think that it is actually a very useful reaction because clearly Russia did invade Crimea, has been active in the Donbass. Now it has sought to widen its invasion in the whole of Ukraine. And because they haven't made the kind of progress they thought that they might, there is clearly mass slaughter and the flattening of cities. And that's unexpected, and there has been a strong reaction against that. And that has to be a useful check on the actions of those people who are in leadership in their countries and unchecked by those around them, which is the case with Putin in Russia.
Yeah. Looking ahead, and it's a little early to perhaps discuss this, but I think it's important. How would you judge the opportunity for reconciliation for Russia into the future? How would you judge the opportunity there?
I think it's incredibly important. It may seem, as you say, premature, and we've got a long way to go. But I think that a lot of progress had been made in terms of engagement with the Russian people, the opening up to some extent of their country, all sorts of cultural ties. And you see amongst the protesters there and some of the people in the media, very brave people standing out against what President Putin is doing. So I think it's incredibly important that you distinguish between the current leadership in Russia and the Russian people. And it's incredibly important going forward, given that they are receiving their media from a controlled source, and that's where most of them are getting their information from, and that therefore they haven't got necessarily the full picture that one would hope they'd have. It's going to be very important to rebuild relationships in the future when we get past this period.
Of course. And looking at the knock-on effect, the wider effect of that conflict in Europe, is it fair to say that we're seeing a uniting of Europe as a result of that conflict, and maybe even closing some of the divisions that were opened as a result of Brexit?
It's been very striking to see the unity across the EU and the European countries, and I'm glad that we've, as it were, been part of that. We are somewhat outside, of course, because of Brexit, and it shows, to me, it shows very clearly that it is absolutely vital that we recognise that we are part of the European continent and we've got to engage properly in the future. We were, as it were, in the room before, and we need to be in the room again as this goes through and in the future, on foreign affairs, on defence, and all the threats that we collectively face together.
How has Britain's role in being a part of that collection that deals with an issue like Russia's invasion, how has its role changed after leaving the European bloc?
I think we've been in a difficult situation. One of the things which was set aside as a result of Brexit was that kind of global engagement. I think that the Brexiteers played down the extent to which the United Kingdom actually had influence within the EU, especially in terms of foreign affairs and defence. And by removing ourselves, they've been very reluctant to set up simply things like committees where you meet together and discuss these things. And that's got to be put right. It's got to be put right, and it's got to be put right urgently.
Absolutely. I want to go a little bit broader now, staying with Britain, but broadening the topics. Obviously, I know your political experience and outside of politics is quite broad. How far do you believe the pandemic has set back the fight against inequality in the UK?
Clearly, it's affected our economy. So we've been hit by Brexit, and there's no doubt the effect of that. But also, of course, the pandemic. The pandemic is global, and it's affected everybody in terms of their economic situation. And it's vital that as we move forward, that we address this in a way which doesn't deepen those inequalities, and there are real risks of that, and it's very important that we don't do that. One of the striking things about the pandemic, though, was that it showed that a government could intervene and could be trusted to do so. Now, that trust has been undermined, and we'll need to rebuild that, but it does show what can be done, and that the public are very willing, when they've got sound advice, which was coming from the scientists, as to why they should be doing certain things, and that we were all in it together. And that was true in Britain, and it also needed to be true worldwide. And that's one of the things which has been coming over today at the forum, the necessity for making sure that, for example, with vaccines, that these are distributed worldwide. This is a global pandemic, and you'll only address it if you look at it in that way. And that's incredibly important in terms of equity, but it's also important in terms of our self-interest, that unless you deal with the pandemic everywhere, you're not going to tackle it within your own country.
Of course. And one area that has been affected massively is education.
Yes.
And I think it's fair to say that there's a sense, perhaps this is anecdotal, there's a sense that we're kind of coming out of the pandemic or returning to normality, and obviously education is also going through that, with a lot of discussion around bringing children back into classrooms. How have you seen any difference between how the education sector in the UK has attempted to move back to something closer to normality versus other nations, and how they've handled that move away from disruption?
Yes, I mean, I think that we are moving back to normality now, and that children are back in classes, and that universities are now holding lectures in person and so on. Not totally, but to a great extent that's the case. I think that children and students suffered very, very markedly in the pandemic, and you come across many instances where kids' mental health has really declined. I've come across that frequently. And that's very, very concerning. And they've also lost out on their educational opportunities and linking up with teachers and other students. So it's incredibly important to move this forward. I do see in some other countries that they are still being very wary, and I think it's a balance. Clearly, there's still a risk from COVID. And at the moment in Parliament, we've got many, many cases, and there are many cases, for example, in the House of Lords right now. It is going through the place, so there's no doubt about that. But we've got the vaccines and treatments now. We know a lot more about how to deal with it, and it's incredibly important that we don't jeopardise the futures of our children in this instance. And I think that the United Kingdom is right to be opening up in the way that it is, and it's preferable if other countries can find themselves in that position, that they do as well.
Of course. I also want to touch on climate change. It's an important topic at the forum in the past few years, and certainly today it's an issue that the urgency only seems to grow. What more do you believe needs to be done to tackle climate change by the global community as a collective? What are some of the challenges to that kind of collaborative effort? What more can be done?
Well, I think that the pandemic shows what actually can be done when you're facing a crisis, and that we haven't done enough as far as that's concerned. And of course, we're now in the situation where what's happened with Russia now puts puts another question mark over energy prices and so on and availability, and all of that is a huge challenge. But it does show that, as it showed in the pandemic, that if you actually introduce the scientific ideas as to why you need to do this, that people trust that, and politicians need to make sure that they take that forward. COP26 didn't achieve as much as it might have done, but on the other hand, the thing that was different as far as I was concerned was the engagement of the financial sector. I thought that was very interesting, that business and finance were now seeing it as a risk, even if it's only a risk in terms of their reputations. If they didn't address this, clearly we have to have major changes if we are going to tackle this effectively. I'm very pleased to see what is happening in Qatar in terms of the technical expertise that's going to be required, but a tremendous amount of extra work is going to need to go into this. And of course, it'll be Egypt that'll be taking over the COP series soon, taking it on from the United Kingdom, and belonging to a continent which is going to be affected the first and the most. And so therefore it's absolutely vital that we do take this forward and work internationally, work together on addressing this.
And in particular, the UK and the EU, obviously there is still the effects of Brexit being felt and that division there. What can be done there to work better together between the bloc and the UK?
Well, I think that's something that we're going to have to urge our government to do. I hope that it's recognised that this is indeed vital. I mean, I think they recognise in terms of things like sanctions that working together works more effectively than working alone. And that has to be carried over into these other areas as well, and climate change is top of the list.